Mason Thompson watched calmly as the German Shepherd practiced attack maneuvers in the Oak Ridge K9 Training Center's main arena, the dog's powerful muscles rippling beneath its black and tan coat. Without warning, the dog suddenly froze, ears perked toward the entrance, then bolted across the arena toward a wheelchair-bound teenager who had quietly appeared at the gate, causing trainers to shout in panic as they lunged for the dog's leash. 2 years had passed since Ethan Miller's devastating accident left him paralyzed from the waist down, isolating him from the world he once knew. The way Shadow, the most aggressive, untrainable dog they'd ever rescued, gently lowered his head and laid at the boy's feet, made Mason's blood run cold. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Montana sunlight streamed through the high windows of the Oak Ridge K9 Training Center, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny stars. It was a humble facility on the outskirts of town, housed in a converted barn with training rings, obstacle courses, and kennels that had seen better days. But despite its worn appearance, the center served a noble purpose, training service dogs for police work and military operations, while providing purpose for the veterans who ran it. Ethan Miller hadn't always been confined to a wheelchair. Just 2 years ago, at 15, he'd been the star quarterback of his high school team, with a natural talent for athletics that made his future seem limitless. His cropped brown hair and strong jawline mirrored his father's, a trait his mother both treasured and found painful since William Miller had disappeared during a military operation in Afghanistan 3 years prior. William had been an elite K9 handler, a man whose connection with military dogs had been legendary among his peers. The ATV accident happened on a crisp autumn day, one moment of reckless teenage exuberance taking a curve too fast. Trying to impress his friends, and Ethan's spinal cord was severed at T10, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. The physical rehabilitation had been grueling, but it was the depression that truly imprisoned him. He withdrew from friends, abandoned his studies, and retreated into a shell of silence that his mother Rebecca couldn't penetrate. Rebecca Miller was a military nurse, her hands steady from years of tending wounds in combat zones. She'd met William during her second tour in Afghanistan, their love blossoming amid the harsh reality of war. Now, with her auburn hair often tied in a practical ponytail and worry lines etched around her blue eyes, she fought a different kind of battle, keeping hope alive for her son while managing her own grief over a husband presumed dead but never found. The German Shepherd named Shadow had his own tragedy. Rescued 6 months ago from an illegal training facility where dogs were conditioned for fighting, his muscular body bore scars from both physical abuse and emotional trauma. Something in his amber eyes reflected a wildness that refused to be tamed, a distrust of humans that caused even the most experienced handlers at Oak Ridge to approach him with caution. What no one knew yet was that Shadow's history extended beyond the fighting ring, back to the very deserts where William Miller had disappeared. Rebecca Miller hesitated at the entrance to the Oak Ridge K9 Training Center, her hand resting protectively on the back of Ethan's wheelchair. She hadn't been sure about bringing him here today. The training center was filled with reminders of William, the techniques, the commands. Even the smell of the place echoed her husband's passion. But Dr. Harmon, Ethan's therapist, had suggested finding connections to activities that once brought him joy, and before the accident, Ethan had loved helping his father with the dogs. "We don't have to stay long," she promised, leaning down to speak quietly near his ear. Ethan didn't respond. His gaze fixed ahead with the vacant expression that had become all too familiar since the accident. His once animated face rarely showed emotion now, as though the injury had paralyzed not just his body, but his spirit as well. Mason Thompson greeted them at the door, his weathered face breaking into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. At 45. Mason carried himself with military precision despite the slight limp in his left leg, a souvenir from an IED explosion during his last deployment. Rebecca had heard that Mason suffered from PTSD, though he never spoke of it. "Mrs. Miller, good to see you," Mason said, offering his hand. "And you must be Ethan. Your mother tells me you used to work with dogs." Ethan barely nodded, his fingers fidgeting with the small backpack in his lap, a nervous habit he'd developed since the accident. "We're running some basic obedience drills today," Mason continued, gesturing toward the main arena where several handlers worked with their dogs. "Nothing too exciting, but you're welcome to watch. We've got a few new rescues that came in last week." Rebecca wheeled Ethan toward the viewing area, positioning his chair where he could see the training sessions. She hoped for some spark of interest, any sign that this wasn't another failed attempt to connect with her son. For 20 minutes, they watched in silence as handlers put their dogs through various commands: sit, stay, heel. Ethan's expression remained unchanged, his shoulders slumped in his chair. Just as Rebecca was about to suggest they leave, Mason entered the arena with a large German Shepherd on a reinforced lead. The dog moved with coiled tension, its powerful body seeming barely contained by the leash. "That's Shadow," Mason explained, noticing Ethan's gaze finally shift. "We rescued him from a fighting ring 6 months ago. He's been challenging." As if to illustrate the point, Shadow suddenly lunged at a passing trainer, teeth bared in a snarl that echoed through the arena. Mason quickly corrected him, but the message was clear: this was a dangerous animal, unpredictable and volatile. Yet something in the dog's behavior caught Ethan's attention for the first time since arriving. He straightened in his wheelchair, his eyes following Shadow's movements with unexpected focus. "Can I get closer?" Ethan asked, his voice rusty from disuse. Rebecca tensed. "I don't think that's a good idea. That dog seems aggressive." "It's not aggression," Ethan said quietly. "It's fear." Mason raised an eyebrow, studying Ethan with newfound interest. "Your son has a good eye. Mrs. Miller. Shadow doesn't trust easily, especially men. We've had him for months, and he's still defensive with most of our trainers." Before Rebecca could protest further, Ethan was already wheeling himself toward the arena entrance. She hurried after him, heart pounding with maternal alarm. "Ethan, wait. You can't just—" But he was already through the gate, his wheelchair moving steadily across the training floor. The other handlers paused their activities, exchanging concerned glances. Shadow, who had been performing reluctant obedience drills with Mason, suddenly went rigid, his attention locked on the approaching wheelchair. "Get him out of here," shouted one of the senior trainers, a burly man named Frank. "That dog isn't safe around strangers, especially kids." Mason tightened his grip on Shadow's lead, preparing to pull the dog back. But something unexpected happened. Shadow's aggressive posture softened, his ears shifting from their pinned-back position to an alert, curious stance. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood canine body language. Ethan stopped his wheelchair about 10 feet away from Shadow. Instead of reaching out or calling to the dog, he simply sat still, his eyes meeting Shadow's with quiet intensity. The arena fell silent, the tension palpable as everyone watched the standoff between the damaged boy and the dangerous dog. "Don't make any sudden moves," Mason warned, still holding Shadow's leash tightly. But Ethan wasn't listening. He slowly extended his hand, palm down, at the level of his lap, not reaching toward the dog, but offering himself in a way that seemed both vulnerable and confident. Rebecca held her breath, poised to rush forward at the first sign of trouble. Every maternal instinct screamed for her to pull Ethan away, to protect him from further harm. She'd already lost her husband to dangerous work. She couldn't bear to see her son injured again. Shadow took a cautious step forward, then another. His body still tense, but his aggression replaced by something that looked remarkably like curiosity. Mason allowed the leash to slacken slightly, his expression a mixture of concern and amazement. "He's never approached anyone voluntarily," Mason murmured. "Not like this." When Shadow was just a foot away from Ethan's wheelchair, he paused, nostrils flaring as he caught the boy's scent. Everyone in the arena seemed to hold their breath, watching as the dog made his assessment. Then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible from an animal with such a violent history, Shadow lowered his head and placed it softly on Ethan's knee. The collective gasp from the onlookers was audible. Rebecca's hands flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Not from fear now, but from witnessing something she had thought impossible, her son's face transformed by a smile, small but real, as he cautiously raised his hand to touch the top of Shadow's head. "Dad always said, dogs know things we don't," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They can sense what's broken inside us." Mason knelt beside them, his weathered face showing genuine wonder. "I've been working with military dogs for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's like he recognizes you somehow." The center's director, a retired Army colonel named Harris, approached with a frown creasing his forehead. "Thompson, this is completely against protocol. That animal is scheduled for behavioral assessment next week. If he can't show improvement, we're looking at euthanasia options." Rebecca stepped forward, protective instincts flaring. "My son has made more progress with that dog in 5 minutes than your trainers have in months." Surely that counts for something. For the first time in 2 years, Ethan looked up with determination in his eyes. "Let me work with him," he said, his voice stronger than Rebecca had heard since the accident. "I know I can help him." The following weeks unfolded like the slow turning of pages in a story neither Ethan nor Shadow knew they were writing together. Each morning, Rebecca would drive Ethan to the Oak Ridge K9 Training Center, her reluctance gradually giving way to cautious hope as she witnessed her son awakening from the emotional hibernation that had claimed him since the accident. The wheelchair that had once seemed like a prison now became a chariot carrying him toward purpose, toward Shadow. Colonel Harris had been reluctant to approve their sessions, citing liability concerns and the center's already precarious financial situation. "One incident with that dog," he'd warned, "and we could lose everything." But Mason had advocated fiercely for them, offering to personally supervise each training session and take responsibility for any issues that arose. In the end, Harris had relented, though his skepticism remained evident in his furrowed brow whenever he observed their work. On a crisp autumn morning 3 weeks into their training, Ethan sat in the smaller training ring with Shadow, working on basic trust exercises. The dog's improvement had been remarkable, from an animal that lunged aggressively at strangers to one that now stayed reliably at Ethan's side, alert but calm. "He's responding to your energy," Mason observed from his position at the edge of the ring. "You're calm, so he's calm. Most handlers try to dominate dogs like Shadow, especially ones with his history, but you're doing something different." Ethan ran his hand along Shadow's flank, feeling the ridges of old scars beneath the thick fur. "My dad always said the best handlers don't control their dogs, they partner with them. He said force just creates resistance." Mason's expression shifted at the mention of William Miller, a shadow crossing his features that Ethan didn't miss. There was something there, something Mason wasn't saying about his father, but Ethan didn't press, not yet. "Show me that command sequence again," Mason said, changing the subject. "The one your father taught you." Ethan nodded, turning his wheelchair to face Shadow directly. He made a series of hand gestures, subtle movements that looked almost conversational rather than commanding. Shadow watched intently, then performed a complex series of movements circling Ethan's wheelchair, stopping at specific positions, and finally resting his head gently on Ethan's lap. "That's not standard military protocol," Mason said, his voice tight with an emotion Ethan couldn't quite identify. "Those are specialized signals, used by certain elite K-9 units. How did your father teach you those?" Before Ethan could answer, Frank Dawson, one of the senior trainers, entered the ring with his Belgian Malinois. Frank had made no secret of his disapproval of Ethan's presence, frequently voicing concerns about amateur handlers compromising professional standards. "Thompson," Frank called, his voice carrying the clipped tone of someone used to giving orders. "Harris wants us to run aggression trials on the new recruits. We need this ring." Shadow immediately tensed at Frank's approach, his posture shifting from relaxed to vigilant. Ethan placed a calming hand on the dog's neck, feeling the muscles bunched beneath his fingers. "We've got another 15 minutes scheduled," Mason replied evenly. "The kids had enough playtime with that washout," Frank retorted, gesturing dismissively toward Shadow. "This is a professional training facility, not a petting zoo." Shadow's growl was low, a rumbling warning that vibrated through Ethan's hand. He whispered reassurance to the dog, but kept his eyes on Frank. "Shadow's not a washout," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. "He's responding to training. He just needs patience and the right approach." Frank snorted, leading his Malinois closer. "That dog is damaged goods. Kid, some animals can't be fixed. The kindest thing would be putting him down before he hurts someone." Something cold and hard formed in Ethan's chest, a familiar feeling he'd experienced when doctors had explained his prognosis after the accident. The label of permanent disability had been assigned to him just as casually as Frank was dismissing Shadow's potential. "You're wrong," Ethan said, "and I'll prove it." The confrontation might have escalated further had Rebecca not arrived at that moment, entering the training ring with determination written across her features. She'd taken to watching Ethan's sessions from a distance, giving him independence while keeping a maternal eye on proceedings. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her nurse's training evident in her calm but authoritative tone. Mason stepped between Frank and Ethan. "No problem?" Frank was just leaving to work with his dog in the main arena. With a final dismissive glance, Frank departed, but the tension lingered in the air like the scent of an approaching storm. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he stroked Shadow's fur, the emotional confrontation having taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. Rebecca knelt beside his wheelchair, her eyes searching his face. "Maybe we should head home early today. You look tired." "I'm fine, Mom." The edge in Ethan's voice was new, a reclaiming of assertion she hadn't heard since before the accident. She hesitated, then nodded. "I actually came to tell you I've been talking with Dr. Stevens about your physical therapy schedule. If you're going to be working with Shadow regularly, we should adjust your sessions to prevent fatigue." What remained unspoken was her growing acceptance of this new development in Ethan's life. She'd begun researching service dogs for people with spinal cord injuries, learning how they could assist with daily tasks and provide independence. The possibility that Shadow, this formerly aggressive rescue, might become that for Ethan still seemed far-fetched, but she'd seen enough to keep an open mind. Later that afternoon, as Mason helped Ethan transfer from his wheelchair to the passenger seat of Rebecca's SUV, he made a decision. "There's something I need to show you," he said, his voice low enough that Rebecca, who was loading Ethan's wheelchair into the back, couldn't hear. "Can you come by my office tomorrow?" "Alone." Ethan studied Mason's face, noting the lines of tension around his eyes. "Is it about Shadow?" "It's about your father," Mason replied, straightening up as Rebecca approached. And yes, it might be about Shadow, too. That night, Ethan lay awake long after his mother had gone to bed, staring at the ceiling where stars had been painted when he was a child. His father had done that, climbed a ladder with pots of luminous paint to create constellations that glowed in the dark, telling Ethan stories about celestial navigation and how even lost soldiers could find their way home by looking up. The next day, Rebecca dropped Ethan at the center earlier than usual, having been called into the hospital for an emergency shift. "I can cancel if you need me to stay," she offered. But Ethan assured her he would be fine with Mason. Instead of heading to the training ring, Ethan made his way to Mason's small office at the back of the facility. The space was Spartan, a metal desk, filing cabinets, and walls covered with photographs of military working dogs and their handlers. Ethan's wheelchair barely fit through the door, requiring him to maneuver carefully to avoid knocking items from the cluttered shelves. Mason was waiting, a manila folder on the desk before him. "Close the door," he said, his usual composure replaced by visible unease. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, positioning his wheelchair across from Mason. Mason opened the folder and removed a photograph, sliding it across the desk. This was taken 4 years ago, during a special operations deployment in Kandahar province. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There in the photo was his father, William Miller, standing next to a younger Mason Thompson. Between them sat a German shepherd with distinctive markings, a pattern of black and tan that Ethan had come to know intimately over the past weeks. "That's Shadow," he whispered, his fingers tracing the outline of the dog in the photograph. Mason nodded, his jaw tight. "His military designation was Echo 7, but your father always called him Shadow because of how he would stay in your dad's shadow during patrols. They were inseparable." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. "But why didn't you tell me? I wasn't certain at first," Mason admitted. "Shadow was badly injured during the operation where your father went missing. The military reported him as killed in action along with your father. When I recognized him at the rescue operation from that fighting ring, I couldn't believe it. The identification microchip had been removed, but those markings are unique." Ethan's mind raced, connecting dots he hadn't seen before Shadow's immediate response to him, the way the dog had recognized commands that Ethan had learned from his father, the inexplicable bond that had formed between them. "Does my mom know?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Mason shook his head. "I couldn't tell her, not until I was sure, and not until I figured out how to tell her the rest." "What rest?" Ethan's heart pounded against his ribs. Mason's face crumpled slightly, the stoic soldier giving way to a man carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. "I was there, Ethan. I was with your father the day he disappeared. We were separated during an ambush. Shadow was with him. Not me. I made it to the extraction point, but they didn't." The tension in the small office thickened, years of unspoken grief and guilt hanging between them. "You left them behind," Ethan said, the words falling like stones. "I tried to go back." Mason's voice broke. "Command refused to authorize a rescue mission. The area was too hot, the risk too great. By the time we could return, there was no sign of either of them, just blood. They were declared killed in action, but no bodies were ever found." Ethan finished, a fact he'd clung to during countless sleepless nights when he'd imagined his father somehow surviving, making his way home against impossible odds. "Shadow's survival means—" Mason started. "It means my father might still be alive too," Ethan said, a dangerous hope flaring in his chest. The revelation about Shadow's identity changed everything and nothing. The training continued. But now each session carried the weight of unspoken questions, of possibilities too fragile to voice aloud. Ethan hadn't told his mother about Mason's disclosure, a secret that sat heavy on his conscience. He told himself he was protecting her from false hope. But in truth, he needed time to process the implications himself. Shadow seemed to sense the shift in Ethan, becoming even more attentive, more responsive to his commands. The dog that had once been deemed untrainable now moved in perfect synchrony with Ethan's wheelchair, anticipating his needs with an almost uncanny awareness. When Ethan dropped items, a constant frustration given his limited mobility, Shadow retrieved them without prompting. When Ethan struggled to navigate difficult terrain, Shadow positioned himself as a steady support. "He's not just obeying commands," Mason observed during a particularly successful training session. "He's problem-solving. That's rare, even among the best service dogs." October brought crisp air and golden light to the mountains surrounding Oak Ridge. The training center buzzed with renewed activity as local law enforcement arrived for their annual K-9 certification tests. Ethan watched from the sidelines as police dogs demonstrated their skills in tracking, apprehension, and evidence recovery. Shadow sat alertly beside his wheelchair, studying the other dogs with what Ethan had come to recognize as professional interest. "Your dog's got the look," commented Officer Rodriguez, a K-9 handler with the county sheriff's department. "Military trained, right, you can tell by the focus." Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of pride. "He was my dad's military partner." Rodriguez's expression shifted to one of respect. "Military working dogs are elite. What's your dad doing now? Private security?" The innocent question landed like a blow. "He was deployed in Afghanistan. He didn't come back." Rodriguez removed his hat. "I'm sorry, son. Your dad was a hero." He glanced at Shadow with newfound appreciation. "And so is his dog. You two look like you've got a special bond." The conversation was interrupted by Colonel Harris, who approached with a determined stride. Since the day Shadow had first responded to Ethan, Harris had maintained a cautious distance, monitoring their progress through reports rather than direct observation. Today, however, his attention was focused intently on them. "Miller," he addressed Ethan formally, "I've been reviewing Thompson's reports on your work with Shadow. The progress is notable." Coming from Harris, this was high praise indeed. Ethan straightened in his wheelchair, feeling Shadow press closer to his side. "The annual K-9 demonstration challenge is 6 weeks away," Harris continued. "It's primarily for professional teams, but there's a companion exhibition category. Thompson thinks you and Shadow should enter." Ethan's heart raced. The challenge was the most prestigious K-9 event in the region, drawing teams from military, law enforcement, and professional training facilities across several states. The idea that he and Shadow might participate seemed simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. "What would we need to do?" Ethan asked, working to keep his voice steady. "Demonstrate a series of service dog tasks. Show off any specialized skills you've developed. The exhibition isn't competitive per se, but it's a showcase for exceptional partnerships." Harris's gaze shifted to Shadow. "It would also help the center's reputation to show what we can accomplish with rescue dogs. Funding has been tight this year." As Harris walked away, Officer Rodriguez gave Ethan a friendly clap on the shoulder. "That's a big deal, kid. Harris doesn't extend that invitation lightly." That evening, when Rebecca arrived to pick him up, Ethan shared the news about the challenge invitation. Her reaction was complicated pride warring with concern, her protective instincts flaring at the thought of Ethan performing in front of hundreds of strangers. "It's a lot of pressure," she said cautiously, "and you've only been working with Shadow for a couple of months." "Mom," This is the first thing I've wanted to do, really wanted since the accident. Ethan replied, his voice catching. Please don't say no. Rebecca studied her son's face, seeing something there she'd feared was lost forever: passion, determination, hope. She thought of the countless specialists and therapists who had tried to help Ethan regain his emotional footing after the accident, of the medications that sat mostly untouched on his nightstand, of the friends whose calls had gone unreturned for months. Okay, she said finally, but I want to be involved in the training, and if at any point it becomes too much. It won't. Ethan interrupted, a smile breaking across his face like sunrise. We're going to be amazing. You'll see. The next 6 weeks transformed Ethan's life with the intensity of a season compressed into days. Mornings began with physical therapy exercises designed to strengthen his upper body for the demands of handling Shadow. Afternoons were devoted to training, developing and refining a routine that showcased Shadow's intelligence and their unique partnership. Mason worked with them relentlessly, pushing both dog and handler to their limits, then beyond. The challenge isn't just about showing tricks, he explained. It's about demonstrating true communication between handler and dog. The best teams make it look effortless, but that comes from countless hours of practice. They developed a sequence that highlighted Shadow's service dog capabilities: retrieving dropped items, opening doors, providing stability for transfers from the wheelchair, even bringing Ethan's emergency medication from his backpack on command. But they also incorporated elements that spoke to Shadow's military background: precise positioning, alert responses to potential threats, and the seamless anticipation of Ethan's needs. As they trained, Ethan found himself regaining physical strength he had lost during his months of depression. The muscles in his arms and shoulders grew more defined, his endurance improved, and his confidence along with it. Rebecca noticed the changes, not just physical, but emotional. Ethan laughed more, engaged in conversations at dinner, even reconnected with a few friends via text. Whatever happens at this challenge, she told Mason one afternoon as they watched Ethan and Shadow rehearse, you've given my son back to me. I can never thank you enough for that. Mason's expression remained guarded, the burden of his secret about William Miller's disappearance still weighing heavily. Ethan's done the hard work himself, he replied. Shadow just helped him find the motivation. Not everyone at Oak Ridge shared their enthusiasm. Frank Dawson continued to voice skepticism about Shadow's reliability, frequently pointing out that a dog with a history of aggression could never be trusted completely. One trigger, one flashback, and that military training becomes a liability. He warned during a staff meeting. The kid won't be able to control him if that happens. His concerns found receptive ears among some board members, particularly those focused on the center's liability insurance. The resulting debate split the Oak Ridge staff into factions: those who believed in Ethan and Shadow's remarkable progress, and those who saw an unacceptable risk to the center's reputation and finances. The controversy spilled beyond Oak Ridge when local media caught wind of the unusual partnership. A reporter from the county newspaper visited to do a feature story on the upcoming challenge, focusing on the inspiring tale of a paralyzed teen and his rescued military dog. The article, while well-intentioned, contained several inaccuracies and emphasized Ethan's disability in ways that made him uncomfortable. Worse, when the story hit social media, it attracted cruel comments questioning whether a kid in a wheelchair could properly handle a working dog, suggesting the whole thing was a publicity stunt for the struggling training center. Some commenters even mockingly referred to Ethan as the crippled dog whisperer, a nickname that spread despite efforts to combat it. Rebecca was furious, wanting to confront the newspaper and demand a retraction. Ethan, however, responded with unexpected maturity. People are always going to talk, he told his mother. "All that matters is what Shadow and I do in that arena." Still, the negativity took its toll. Ethan grew quieter during training sessions, pushing himself harder, determined to prove the skeptics wrong. Mason noticed the change, pulling him aside after a particularly grueling practice. "You can't train with something to prove," he advised. "Your connection with Shadow isn't about them, it's about trust between you and your dog. Keep it there." 4 weeks before the challenge, Ethan's physical therapist expressed concern about the intensity of his training schedule. "You're pushing too hard," Dr. Westfield warned. "Your body is still adapting to life with a spinal cord injury. Overtraining risks serious setbacks." Rebecca immediately advocated for reducing their practice sessions. "Your health comes first," she insisted. "The challenge isn't worth risking your recovery." But Ethan refused to scale back. "I'm fine," he maintained, though the dark circles under his eyes and the tremor in his hands at the end of long days told a different story. Shadow seemed to sense his exhaustion, growing more protective, more attentive to Ethan's needs even when not commanded. It was during this tense period that Mason finally decided to share his full story with Rebecca. He invited her for coffee at a quiet diner in town, away from the curious ears at Oak Ridge. For nearly 2 hours, he spoke about his service with William Miller, about the mission that had gone wrong, and about Shadow's miraculous reappearance years after being presumed dead alongside his handler. Rebecca listened in stunned silence, tears tracking down her cheeks as Mason described her husband's final known moments. When he finished, she sat motionless, her coffee long cold before her. "Why tell me now?" she finally asked, her voice eerily calm. "Because Shadow's identity will eventually come out," Mason replied. "Military working dogs have records, documentation. Someone at the challenge might recognize him. And because Ethan already knows—" Her head snapped up. "You told my son before me." "He deserved to know who Shadow really was," Mason said quietly. "And I needed to tell someone about that day. It's been eating at me for years." Rebecca's anger flared briefly, then subsided under the weight of exhaustion. Too many emotions, too many revelations. "Does this mean do you think William could still be alive?" Mason hesitated. The military conducted extensive searches. There was never any evidence he survived the ambush. "But no body," Rebecca pressed. "Just like Shadow presumed dead, but actually alive." "Rebecca," Mason's voice was gentle, "I don't want to give you false hope. The chances are—" "I've lived on hope for 3 years," she interrupted. "Some days it's all I've had. Finding out about Shadow. It changes things. Mason, you must see that." The conversation left both of them drained, but it also forged a new understanding between them. When Rebecca confronted Ethan that evening about keeping Shadow's identity secret from her, her anger was tempered by compassion for what her son must have been feeling, the complex mix of hope and fear that had been her constant companion since William's disappearance. "No more secrets between us," she told Ethan, holding his hands tightly in hers. "Whatever happens, whatever we learn about your father, we face it together." The revelation about Shadow brought Rebecca fully into their training regimen. She adjusted her hospital schedule to attend sessions, offering support and increasingly enthusiastic encouragement. Her medical background proved valuable in helping Mason develop a training schedule that challenged Ethan without risking his health. 3 weeks before the challenge, they faced an unexpected obstacle. Colonel Harris called an emergency board meeting after receiving complaints from several local K-9 handlers, including Frank Dawson, expressing concern about Shadow's participation in such a public event. The formal objection cited Shadow's history of aggression and the potential liability if he reverted to previous behavior patterns during the demonstration. The board meeting was tense, with passionate arguments from both sides. Frank Dawson presented documentation of Shadow's initial assessment upon arrival at Oak Ridge, reports detailing aggressive episodes, resistance to training, and recommendations for possible euthanasia if rehabilitation failed. This dog was deemed dangerous by professional evaluators, Frank argued. One incident on stage at the challenge could destroy this center's reputation and expose us to lawsuits. Is that a risk we're willing to take for one feel-good story? Mason countered with detailed logs of Shadow's progress, video demonstrations of his flawless performance of service tasks, and testimonials from center staff who had witnessed the transformation in both dog and handler. What we're seeing with Ethan and Shadow isn't just a feel-good story, Mason insisted. It's a breakthrough in rehabilitation techniques for trauma-affected working dogs. The publicity from their demonstration could bring in grants, donations, recognition that Oak Ridge desperately needs. The debate might have continued indefinitely had Ethan not asked to address the board himself. Wheeling into the center of the room with Shadow at his side, he presented his case with quiet dignity. "Before my accident, I was an athlete," he began. "I defined myself by what my body could do. When that was taken away, I lost more than the use of my legs. I lost my sense of purpose, my identity." His voice remained steady, though his hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair tightly. "Shadow was like me. He had a purpose, serving alongside my father in Afghanistan. When he was captured and abused, he lost that purpose. He became afraid, defensive, just trying to survive in a world that had hurt him." Ethan reached down to rest his hand on Shadow's head. The dog looked up at him with complete trust, a stark contrast to the aggressive animal described in Frank's reports. "We found each other when we both needed it most. I'm not asking for special treatment or exceptions to your rules. I'm asking for the chance to show what's possible when you don't give up on someone human or animal just because they're damaged." The room fell silent when he finished speaking. Even Frank Dawson seemed moved, though his professional concerns remained evident in his furrowed brow. After a brief deliberation, the board voted to allow Ethan and Shadow to participate in the challenge. Though with additional safety precautions, Shadow would wear a special training vest identifying him as a working dog in training, and Mason would stand by during their demonstration, ready to intervene if necessary. As the meeting dispersed, Frank approached Ethan with an unexpected offering. "You made good points in there, kid," he acknowledged. "I still have concerns about Shadow's background, but I respect what you've accomplished with him." He handed Ethan a business card. "My cousin works with adaptive sports programs for people with spinal cord injuries. Thought you might be interested after the challenge is over." The gesture marked a turning point at Oak Ridge. While some staff remained cautious around Shadow, the open hostility disappeared, replaced by professional curiosity about the techniques Ethan was using to connect with the formerly aggressive dog. With the board's approval secured, training intensified in the final weeks before the challenge. Ethan and Shadow practiced their routine until every movement flowed seamlessly into the next, until commands barely needed to be spoken aloud, communicated instead through subtle hand gestures and body language. Mason worked with them daily, refining their presentation, offering suggestions for modifications that would highlight Shadow's intelligence and adaptability. "The judges will be looking for evidence of true partnership," he explained. "Not just obedience, but mutual trust and communication." 2 weeks before the challenge, a small group gathered at Oak Ridge to watch a full rehearsal of their routine. Rebecca invited Dr. Westfield, Ethan's physical therapist, and Dr. Harmon, his psychologist, both of whom had been skeptical about the intensive training program. As Ethan and Shadow moved through their complex sequence of commands and responses, the professionals exchanged glances of amazement. "I've never seen him so confident." Dr. Harmon whispered to Rebecca, The change in his affect, his engagement, it's remarkable. Dr. Pert Westfield nodded agreement. His upper body strength has improved dramatically, and look at his posture in the chair. The core stability he's developed is extraordinary. At the conclusion of the rehearsal, spontaneous applause broke out among the small audience. Shadow, true to his training, remained focused on Ethan, unperturbed by the noise. Ethan's face flushed with a combination of exertion and pride as Mason approached with a rare, full smile. "That," Mason declared, "is a challenge-worthy performance." As the day of the demonstration drew closer, Ethan found himself thinking more about his father, imagining William's reaction to seeing his son working with his former military partner. Would he be proud? Would he recognize the commands Ethan had modified from those his father had taught him years ago? The questions remained unanswerable, yet somehow less painful than before. Working with Shadow had connected Ethan to his father in ways that memories alone could not. The night before the challenge, Ethan dreamed of running across an open field, Shadow bounding at his side. In the dream, his legs worked perfectly, carrying him effortlessly over the ground. He woke with tears on his face, not from grief this time, but from a strange combination of acceptance and hope. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever the future held, he had found something he'd thought lost forever, the ability to move forward. The Montana Event Center buzzed with activity as competitors and spectators filtered through the massive doors for the K9 Demonstration Challenge. Working dogs of every variety, Belgian Malinois with intense focus, Labrador Retrievers with wagging tails, German Shepherds standing at alert moved alongside their handlers through the crowded lobby. The air crackled with anticipation and the occasional bark or whine from a dog sensing the excitement. Ethan sat in his wheelchair near the competitor's entrance, Shadow positioned perfectly at his side. Despite the chaos around them, the German Shepherd remained calm, his attention divided between vigilant observation of their surroundings and frequent checks of Ethan's face. They had arrived early at Mason's insistence, allowing Shadow time to acclimate to the unfamiliar environment before their demonstration. "Nervous?" Mason asked, crouching beside Ethan's wheelchair. He wore his formal Oak Ridge uniform, a crisp black polo and tactical pants with a staff credential hanging from a lanyard around his neck. Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. His stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and terror he hadn't felt since his football days. Back then, pre-game jitters had been familiar companions, but those games seemed trivial compared to what today represented not just a performance, but a public declaration of who he was now, who he could still be despite his paralysis. Rebecca arrived with coffee and bottled water, her face tight with the strain of maintaining a calm demeanor for her son's benefit. "The arena is filling up fast," she reported. "They've added extra seating because of the article in the Tribune." The newspaper's follow-up feature on Ethan and Shadow had gone viral online, drawing attention far beyond their small Montana community. What had begun as a local human interest story had transformed into something larger, a narrative about second chances that resonated across social media. The pressure of those expectations now sat heavily on Ethan's shoulders. "Remember," Mason said, his voice low and steady, "it's just you and Shadow in that ring. Don't think about the crowd, the judges, or anything else. Focus on your connection with your dog. That's what got you here." Colonel Harris approached, clipboard in hand, his military bearing more pronounced in the formal setting. "Miller, you're scheduled fourth in the companion exhibition category. 3 teams ahead of you, all with service dogs." He hesitated, then added gruffly, "There are some VIPs in attendance today, military personnel interested in Oak Ridge's rehabilitation program. No pressure, but a strong showing could mean additional funding for the center." As Harris moved on to brief other competitors, Rebecca squeezed Ethan's shoulder. "He shouldn't have told you that. You have enough on your mind. It's okay, Mom, Ethan replied, reaching up to cover her hand with his. Shadow and I are ready for this. They moved toward the staging area where competitors waited their turn. The first 3 teams in their category were already lined up: a woman with a seizure-alert dog, a veteran with a PTSD service animal, and an elderly man with a mobility assistance retriever. All 3 handlers nodded respectfully to Ethan. Professional courtesy between people who understood the bond between human and working dog. The veteran, a man in his 30s with a prosthetic leg, wheeled his chair alongside Ethan's. "First competition?" he asked, noting Ethan's tense posture. "That obvious?" Ethan managed a weak smile. "Was the same my first time," the man said. "I'm Jake. This is Ranger." He indicated the calm golden retriever at his side. 3 years as my partner after I came home from Iraq. Best decision I ever made." The simple interaction settled something in Ethan's chest. Here was someone who understood the unique relationship between a disabled handler and their service dog, not as something inspirational or extraordinary, but as a practical partnership built on mutual need and respect. The exhibition category began with the announcer's enthusiastic introduction of the first team. Ethan watched on the monitor as each handler and dog demonstrated their skills to appreciative applause. The routines were polished, clearly well practiced, showcasing the dog's abilities to perform crucial tasks for their handlers. "Ethan Miller and Shadow," called the stage manager. "You're on deck." Rebecca gave him a quick hug, her whispered "I love you" barely audible over the applause for the team currently performing. Mason checked Shadow's training vest one final time, ensuring the special Oak Ridge patch was clearly visible. "Remember," Mason said, locking eyes with Ethan, "no matter what happens out there, what you've accomplished with Shadow is already extraordinary. This is just a chance to share it with others." The previous team exited to enthusiastic applause, the handler beaming with pride as his service dog trotted happily at his side. The stage manager gestured Ethan toward the entrance ramp. "They're announcing you now. Good luck, kid." The announcer's voice boomed through the arena. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next team in the companion exhibition category represents the Oak Ridge K9 Training Center. Please welcome 17-year-old Ethan Miller and his German Shepherd service dog, Shadow." The bright lights momentarily blinded Ethan as he wheeled into the arena, Shadow moving in perfect position beside him. The crowd was a blur of faces, their numbers far greater than he'd anticipated. For a terrifying moment, his mind went blank, the carefully rehearsed routine evaporating under the pressure of hundreds of watching eyes. Then Shadow leaned subtly against his leg, a gentle pressure, a reminder of presence, and Ethan's focus returned. He positioned his wheelchair in the center of the performance area, took a deep breath, and began. "Shadow, assist," he commanded clearly, dropping his water bottle deliberately onto the floor. Without hesitation, Shadow retrieved the bottle, placing it precisely in Ethan's hand, the simple task demonstrated flawlessly. Ethan moved into more complex commands. "Door," sending Shadow to pull open a prop door using a special strap. "Phone," directing him to fetch the emergency phone from a table and bring it to Ethan. "Brace," positioning Shadow to provide stability as Ethan demonstrated a partial weight transfer from his wheelchair. Each task flowed seamlessly into the next, Shadow's responses immediate and precise. The audience watched in appreciative silence, occasionally breaking into applause at particularly impressive demonstrations. Ethan's confidence grew with each successful command, his voice becoming stronger, his movements more assured. For the finale, they had planned something special, a sequence that highlighted Shadow's military training while demonstrating the depth of trust between them. Ethan removed Shadow's service vest, revealing the distinctive tactical harness beneath that marked him as a working dog of a different kind. "Shadow, guard," Ethan commanded. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Shadow's posture shifted from attentive service dog to alert protector, his focus intensifying as he began a precise patrol around Ethan's wheelchair, checking in at regular intervals with quick eye contact before resuming his vigilant circuit. Ethan then wheeled himself into a vulnerable position with his back to the entrance of the arena. "Shadow, watch." Understanding the command, Shadow positioned himself facing the potential threat, his body language communicating clear warning to any who might approach. When Ethan deliberately dropped his keys with a loud clatter, Shadow didn't break position, maintaining his protective stance despite the distraction. "Shadow, clear." With military precision, Shadow performed a rapid survey of their surroundings, checking behind obstacles placed in the arena, returning to Ethan's side to indicate the area was secure. The series of commands demonstrated not only Shadow's specialized training, but the absolute trust between handler and dog, Ethan relying on Shadow's senses and abilities to protect him in ways his paralyzed body could not. For the final demonstration, Ethan issued a command that wasn't part of their rehearsed routine. "Shadow, remember." The German Shepherd looked directly at Ethan, ears forward, head slightly tilted in a posture of intense listening. Then, without additional prompting, Shadow performed a sequence they had never practiced in public, the specialized signals Ethan had learned from his father. Movements unique to William Miller's training protocols. A murmur ran through the audience, particularly from the section where military personnel sat watching. These weren't standard service dog commands or even typical police K9 maneuvers. They were specific to elite military working dogs trained for special operations. As Shadow completed the sequence, returning to a perfect sit at Ethan's side, the arena erupted in thunderous applause. Ethan reached down to ruffle the fur between Shadow's ears, whispering praise that only the dog could hear. They had done it performed flawlessly despite the pressure. The crowds, the blinding lights. The judging panel rose to their feet, joining the standing ovation that swept through the arena. Ethan felt tears threatening and blinked them rapidly away, unwilling to cry on what should be a moment of triumph. Shadow remained steadfast beside him, unperturbed by the noise and commotion, his focus entirely on his handler. As they exited the arena to continued applause, Rebecca waited in the wings, her face streaked with tears of pride. "That was incredible," she managed, pulling Ethan into a fierce hug. "Your father would have been so proud." Mason stood a few steps behind her, his expression a complex mix of emotions. "That last sequence," he said when Rebecca released Ethan. "Those were William's signals. I haven't seen those movements since Afghanistan." Ethan nodded. "I wanted to honor Dad. I hoped." He didn't finish the sentence, but Mason understood. It had been a tribute, a way of connecting William Miller to this moment of triumph for his son. They made their way to the competitors' area, where other handlers offered congratulations and professional appreciation for Shadow's performance. Several service dog trainers asked detailed questions about Ethan's techniques, particularly how he had rehabilitated a dog with Shadow's troubled history. As they navigated the crowded backstage area, a distinguished man in a dark suit approached, his military bearing evident despite civilian clothes. "Mr. Miller," he asked, extending his hand to Ethan, "I'm Colonel James Westfield, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. That was quite a demonstration you and Shadow put on." Ethan shook the offered hand, feeling Shadow press closer to his wheelchair, not aggressively, but protectively. "Thank you, sir." "That final sequence," Colonel Westfield continued, his gaze shifting to Shadow. "Those aren't standard commands. They're specific to a specialized unit that operated in Afghanistan. A unit your father served with, if I'm not mistaken." The backstage area suddenly seemed too small, too crowded. Rebecca moved closer to Ethan's side, her hand coming to rest protectively on his shoulder. "You recognize Shadow," Mason stated, rather than asked. Stepping forward, Colonel Westfield nodded. "Echo 7, one of our finest military working dogs, reported KIA 3 years ago alongside his handler, Sergeant William Miller." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Care to explain how he ended up here?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Rebecca's grip on Ethan's shoulder tightened. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," Mason suggested, gesturing toward an empty preparation room nearby. Once inside, with the door closed against curious ears, Colonel Westfield's formal demeanor softened slightly. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he assured them. "When we received reports of a possible MWD sighting at this event, I came to investigate personally. William Miller was one of our best handlers, and Echo 7 Shadow was one of our most valuable assets. Shadow was rescued from an illegal dog fighting operation 6 months ago," Mason explained. "His military identification chip had been removed. It wasn't until he responded to Ethan that I began to suspect his true identity." Colonel Westfield studied Shadow, who had positioned himself protectively between the stranger and Ethan. "The distinctive marking on his chest is unmistakable. We have DNA records that could confirm it absolutely, but I'm already convinced. The question remains, how did a dog presumed killed in action end up in a fighting ring in Montana?" "Is it possible," Rebecca asked, her voice carefully controlled, "that if Shadow survived that day, my husband might have as well?" The colonel's expression softened with genuine regret. "Mrs. Miller, I understand your question, but I need to be clear, we conducted extensive search operations after the ambush. Sergeant Miller's blood was identified at the scene, along with evidence of catastrophic injuries. While we never recovered his body, not uncommon in that terrain, all intelligence indicated he did not survive." Ethan felt a complex wave of emotions, disappointment warring with a stubborn, persistent hope. "But you were wrong about Shadow," he pointed out. "You identified his blood too, right? Yet here he is." "A fair point," Colonel Westfield acknowledged, "and one that has significant implications for our operational procedures." He knelt to examine Shadow more closely, careful to move slowly under the dog's watchful gaze. The training he displayed today, those specialized commands, they were classified protocols. No one outside the unit should have known them. "My father taught me," Ethan said simply. "Before he deployed, he used to say that someday I might work with military dogs too." The colonel stood, a decision visibly forming behind his eyes. "The military has a substantial investment in dogs like Shadow. Under normal circumstances, he would be reclaimed for service or placed through our official adoption protocols." He held up a hand as Rebecca began to protest. "However, these are hardly normal circumstances. What I witnessed today was a bond as strong as any I've seen between handler and working dog." He reached into his jacket, removing a business card. "I'm recommending that Shadow remain with Ethan through a special exemption to standard protocols. There will be paperwork, and we'll need access to Shadow for a debriefing of sorts tests to determine what he might remember about his final mission with Sergeant Miller." Hope flared in Ethan's chest. "You think Shadow might help you figure out what happened to my dad?" "I can't make promises," Colonel Westfield cautioned. "But military working dogs have provided vital intelligence in the past. Their memories, their associations, can sometimes fill gaps in our understanding of events." Before they could discuss further, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside. The door flew open to reveal an event coordinator, flushed with excitement. "There you are. They're announcing the exhibition results, and your presence is requested immediately in the arena." Colonel Westfield stepped back, nodding respectfully to Ethan. We'll continue this conversation later. For now, I believe you have an award to collect. The return to the arena was a blur of motion and sound. Ethan barely registered the announcement that he and Shadow had been awarded not only first place in their category, but a special recognition for most innovative partnership across all divisions. The trophy was placed in his lap. Photographs were taken, and congratulations offered from judges and competitors alike. Through it all, Shadow remained steadfast beside him, unfazed by the commotion, his attention divided between vigilant awareness of their surroundings and continuous checks of Ethan's well-being. In the midst of the celebration, with camera flashes popping and reporters shouting questions, Ethan felt a profound sense of rightness, as though all the broken pieces of his life were finally beginning to form a new picture, different from what he had imagined for himself, but whole in its own way. Later, as they loaded Shadow into Rebecca's SUV for the drive home, Mason handed Ethan a worn leather dog tag holder. "Found this in my footlocker last night," he said quietly. "Your father gave it to me for safekeeping before our last mission. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got it when you were ready." Ethan opened the small leather pouch, finding not dog tags as expected, but a weathered photograph of himself at 13, standing proudly beside his father and a younger Shadow. All three caught in a moment of perfect happiness. On the back, in William's precise handwriting, "The best teams are built on trust. Never forget." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Ethan tucked the photo carefully into his pocket. Whatever tomorrow brought, whether answers about his father's fate or simply the next step in his journey with Shadow, he would face it with the trust his father had valued so highly. The triumph of the K9 Demonstration Challenge cast a golden glow over the following weeks, transforming Ethan's life in ways both profound and unexpected. Local media celebrated the hometown hero and his remarkable dog, with the Tribune running a front-page feature titled "Unbreakable Bond: How a Boy and His Dog Redefined Courage." Shadow's photograph appeared on community bulletin boards, social media pages, and once, somewhat surreally, on a billboard promoting Montana tourism. For Ethan, the attention was both flattering and uncomfortable. He had never sought the spotlight, and the sudden public interest in his story, in his disability, left him feeling exposed in ways he hadn't anticipated. Strangers approached him at restaurants and stores, wanting to share their own stories of service dogs, or offering well-meaning but often patronizing encouragement about his inspirational journey. "People mean well," Rebecca reminded him one evening after a particularly exhausting trip to the grocery store where they'd been stopped 4 times by admirers. "They see something in you and Shadow that gives them hope." Ethan understood, but still found himself increasingly drawn to the peaceful sanctuary of Oak Ridge, where Shadow was just a dog in training, not a celebrity, and where he was just a handler, not a symbol. The training center had benefited tremendously from their success, with Colonel Harris proudly reporting increased enrollment in their rehabilitation programs and several substantial donations from impressed sponsors. The victory had brought operational changes, too. Harris had appointed Mason to develop a formal program for pairing rescue dogs with handlers with disabilities, using Ethan and Shadow's partnership as a model. The initiative, tentatively called Second Chance Teams, had already drawn interest from several veterans organizations looking for innovative approaches to PTSD treatment and disability support. Even Frank Dawson, once their most vocal critic, had come around, grudgingly acknowledging that Shadow's transformation represented a breakthrough in rehabilitation techniques for aggressive dogs. "Still wouldn't try it with most cases," he'd told Mason, "but I can't argue with those results." Amid this positive momentum, on a crisp November morning 3 weeks after the challenge, disaster struck without warning. Ethan was at school his first full week back in regular classes since before the accident when the call came. Rebecca, white-faced, arrived to pull him from chemistry class, her hands shaking as she wheeled him rapidly toward the parking lot. "There's been a fire at Oak Ridge," she explained, her voice tight with controlled panic as she helped him into the passenger seat. "They're saying it started in the electrical system of the east wing, the kennels." Ethan's blood turned to ice. Shadow, along with several other dogs in advanced training, had been housed in those kennels while their primary handlers were unavailable during weekdays. "Is Shadow—" "Mason didn't say," Rebecca admitted, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as she drove well above the speed limit. "Just that we should come quickly." They arrived to a scene of chaos. Fire trucks lined the long driveway leading to the Oak Ridge facility, their lights flashing against the backdrop of thick black smoke rising from the eastern section of the building. Firefighters moved purposefully through the property, dragging hoses and shouting commands as they battled the blaze that had already consumed a significant portion of the structure. Mason met them at the perimeter established by emergency responders, his face streaked with soot, a makeshift bandage wrapped around his right forearm. "They got most of the dogs out," he reported, his voice hoarse from smoke. "The handlers on duty moved fast once the alarm sounded." "Shadow?" Ethan couldn't form a more complete question, fear constricting his throat. Mason's expression told him everything before the words came. "We can't find him." "Ethan." "He was in the back kennel area when the fire started. Tyler managed to open all the runs, but in the confusion, with smoke everywhere." He gestured helplessly. "The firefighters are still searching, but that section of the building it's not looking good." Rebecca placed a steadying hand on Ethan's shoulder, feeling him tremble beneath her touch. Could he have run from the property? Maybe he was scared and bolted. "We've got people searching the perimeter," Mason assured them. "Shadow's smart. If there was a way out, he might have found it." Ethan barely heard them, his focus narrowing to the burning building where Shadow had last been seen. The dog who had given him back his purpose, who had connected him to his father's memory, who had become an extension of himself. The idea that Shadow might be gone was unbearable. "I need to look for him," Ethan said, already pushing his wheelchair forward. Mason moved to block his path. "You can't go near that building, Ethan. The structure is compromised, and there's still active fire in sections." "He'd come for me," Ethan insisted, his voice rising. "If I was in there, Shadow would find a way to reach me. I can't just sit here." "Ethan." Rebecca's voice was firm but gentle as she knelt beside his wheelchair. "The firefighters are trained for this. They're doing everything possible." The next hours passed in agonizing slowness. More emergency vehicles arrived, additional fire trucks, an ambulance, police cruisers to manage the growing crowd of onlookers. The Oak Ridge staff gathered in a somber group near the main entrance, several handlers comforting dogs who had been rescued, others providing information to emergency responders about the layout of the facility. Colonel Harris moved between groups, his military bearing holding steady despite the disaster unfolding around him. When he approached Ethan and Rebecca, his expression was grave. "The fire marshal believes it started with an electrical fault in the heating system. Old wiring that should have been replaced years ago." His voice carried the weight of responsibility. "I should have pushed harder for those infrastructure upgrades." Rebecca shook her head. "You couldn't have known." "This will set the center back significantly," Harris continued. "Insurance will cover some of the rebuilding, but the operational disruption, the lost training time—" He broke off, seemingly realizing that these concerns, while valid, were not foremost in Ethan's mind. "We're still looking for Shadow," he finished quietly. "Every available person." As afternoon faded into evening, the fire was finally contained, leaving the eastern wing of Oak Ridge a smoldering ruin. Firefighters in full gear continued to move through the wreckage, searching for hot spots and assessing structural stability. The kennels where Shadow had been housed were unrecognizable, reduced to charred timber and melted metal. A young firefighter approached, removing her helmet as she neared Ethan. "You're the kid who works with the German Shepherd, right? The one from the demonstration a few weeks back." Ethan nodded, hope flaring briefly. "We've been through that section thoroughly," she said gently. "I'm sorry, but there's no sign of any dogs remaining in the building. If your dog was in there when the fire took hold—" "He's not dead," Ethan interrupted, his voice flat with certainty. "I would know." The firefighter exchanged a glance with Rebecca, compassion evident in her expression. She'd seen this before, the denial that comes with sudden loss, the desperate belief that somehow, against all evidence, a miracle might still occur. "We'll keep looking around the property," she promised. "Sometimes animals instinctively find escape routes we wouldn't expect." As darkness fell, portable floodlights illuminated the scene, casting harsh shadows across the devastation. Most of the emergency vehicles had departed, leaving behind a skeleton crew to monitor the site overnight. The Oak Ridge staff had dispersed to makeshift accommodations for the rescued dogs, with plans to reconvene in the morning to assess the full extent of the damage. Mason approached Ethan's wheelchair, a thermal blanket in his hands. "You should go home," he said, draping the blanket across Ethan's legs against the growing chill. "There's nothing more we can do tonight." "I'm not leaving," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse but determined. "Not until we find him." Rebecca, who had been speaking with Colonel Harris about temporary housing for the displaced dogs, returned to hear Ethan's declaration. Her face showed the strain of the day, the fear, the exhaustion, the heartbreak of watching her son face yet another devastating loss. "Ethan," she began carefully, "I know how much Shadow means to you, to all of us, but sitting here all night won't—" "Mom," Ethan interrupted, looking up at her with eyes red-rimmed but dry. "After Dad disappeared, you never gave up, even when everyone else said it was hopeless, even when they declared him dead without a body. You kept believing he might come home. That's why we never moved, why you never changed anything in his office." He reached for her hand. "You taught me that sometimes hope is all we have." Rebecca's composure finally broke, tears spilling down her cheeks as she knelt beside his wheelchair. "Oh, Ethan, I didn't realize you understood." "I understand now," he said quietly. "Shadow's alive. I don't care what anyone says. He's too smart, too strong to be trapped in that fire. He's out there somewhere, and I'm going to wait for him." Mason watched this exchange with a complicated mixture of emotions. The rational part of him, the experienced military handler who had seen the devastation of the kennel area firsthand, knew the chances of Shadow's survival were vanishingly small. But another part of him, the part that had witnessed the extraordinary bond between Ethan and the dog that had once belonged to William Miller, couldn't dismiss Ethan's conviction entirely. "I'll stay with him," Mason told Rebecca quietly. "You should go home, get some rest. I'll call if there's any change." Rebecca hesitated, torn between maternal instinct and respect for her son's determination. "I'll bring back coffee and food," she finally conceded, "and warm clothes. It's going to be a cold night." As she walked toward her car, Rebecca glanced back at her son, silhouetted against the floodlights, his wheelchair positioned defiantly facing the ruins of Oak Ridge. In that moment, despite her fear and grief, she felt a surge of fierce pride. The boy who had retreated from the world after his accident, who had surrendered to despair, was now fighting with every ounce of his spirit, not for himself, but for the dog who had helped him rediscover his courage. She would not be the one to tell him it was time to give up hope, not when hope had been her own lifeline for so long. The morning dawned gray and cold, a fine mist clinging to the charred remains of Oak Ridge's eastern wing. Ethan sat motionless in his wheelchair, a thermal blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his eyes red-rimmed from smoke and sleeplessness. Through the long night, he had refused to leave his vigil, accepting only the warm clothes and thermos of coffee Rebecca had brought, declining her repeated pleas to return home for rest. Mason had stayed with him, sometimes sitting silently on an overturned crate beside the wheelchair, sometimes walking the perimeter of the property, calling Shadow's name into the darkness. As sunrise approached, other Oak Ridge staff began to arrive, their faces solemn as they surveyed the destruction in daylight. The reality was worse than any of them had feared, the entire kennel wing destroyed, along with the adjoining training rooms and equipment storage. "Ethan." Colonel Harris approached, his normally crisp appearance disheveled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. "The insurance adjuster will be here soon. I've arranged temporary housing for our remaining dogs at the county animal shelter, but we'll need volunteers to help with transport." Ethan shook his head. "I'm staying here. Shadow might come back." Harris exchanged a glance with Mason, who stood a few paces behind Ethan's wheelchair. The unspoken communication was clear. They both believed Shadow was gone, that Ethan's vigil was futile, but neither had the heart to force the issue. "We'll have people here all day," Harris said gently. "If Shadow returns, someone will call you immediately." "I need to be here myself," Ethan insisted, his voice rough from the smoke and cold. "He'll look for me, not someone else." Further discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Rebecca's SUV, followed closely by a police cruiser. Rebecca hurried toward Ethan, carrying a bag that presumably contained fresh clothes and food. The police officer, a middle-aged woman with a compassionate expression, approached more slowly. "Mrs. Miller," she called. "I'm Officer Daniels. We got your call about the missing service dog." Rebecca nodded, placing a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder. Shadow especially trained a former military working dog. "He's microchipped, but the chip contains classified information, so we need specialized scanners if he's found." She glanced at Mason. "We've notified Colonel Westfield from Special Operations Command, but I wanted local law enforcement aware as well." Officer Daniels took down detailed information about Shadow: physical description, training background, last known location. As she wrote in her notebook, she maintained a professional demeanor, but Ethan could see the doubt in her eyes. Like everyone else, she believed they were searching for a body, not a living dog. "I'll put the word out to all patrols," she promised, "and I'll contact Animal Control to be on the lookout." As Officer Daniels departed, Mason's phone rang. He stepped away to answer, his expression shifting as he listened to the caller. When he returned, there was a strange intensity in his eyes. "That was Colonel Westfield," he told them quietly. "He's flying in today with a specialized team. They're bringing equipment, thermal imaging, scent trackers, things not usually deployed for missing animals." Rebecca frowned. "For Shadow, that seems—" "Not just for Shadow." Mason interrupted. "Westfield believes Shadow's disappearance may connect to questions about William's mission. The timing, right after Shadow's identity was revealed at the challenge. He doesn't think it's coincidental." Ethan looked up sharply. "You think someone started the fire deliberately to get to Shadow?" Mason glanced around, ensuring they couldn't be overheard by the workers beginning to clear debris nearby. "Westfield didn't say that explicitly, but the military takes the security of its assets very seriously, even retired ones. Shadow carried classified operational knowledge, his training, his mission experience with your father." "This is absurd," Rebecca protested, though her voice had dropped to match Mason's hushed tone. "It was an electrical fire. The building was old, the wiring faulty." "Probably," Mason acknowledged. "But Westfield isn't taking chances. His team will conduct a thorough investigation, and in the meantime, they'll help us search for Shadow if he survived." "When he survived," Ethan corrected firmly. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity as insurance representatives, structural engineers, and cleanup crews descended on Oak Ridge. Ethan remained at his post, refusing food and speaking little, his gaze fixed on the surrounding wooded areas where a dog might seek shelter. Rebecca stayed close, her concern for her son growing with each passing hour. Colonel Westfield arrived shortly after noon, accompanied by 3 men in civilian clothes whose military bearing was nonetheless evident in their posture and movement. Ethan recognized the colonel from the challenge, though the events of that triumphant day now seemed to belong to a different lifetime. "Mr. Miller," Westfield greeted him formally, before kneeling to bring himself to eye level with Ethan's wheelchair. His voice softened. "We're going to find your dog, son, one way or another." The specialized team deployed quickly, separating to cover different areas of the property. Their equipment was clearly military-grade thermal scanners more sophisticated than those used by the local fire department. Communication systems that allowed constant contact between team members. Westfield himself remained near Ethan, occasionally consulting a tablet that displayed a topographical map of the area surrounding Oak Ridge. "Shadow was trained for extended operations in hostile territory," the colonel explained as they watched the team work. "If he escaped the fire, his military training would have activated. He'd seek cover, find water, avoid human contact, except with handlers he recognizes." "Like me," Ethan said. "Like you," Westfield agreed. "Or perhaps Mason, given their shared history." As afternoon faded toward evening, the search continued without results. The specialized team expanded their radius, moving deeper into the wooded areas north of the training center. Local volunteers had joined the effort, forming a community response that touched Rebecca deeply. Even Frank Dawson, Shadow's former critic, had arrived with his Malinois to assist in the search, the dog's tracking abilities proving valuable in the difficult terrain. Mason, who had been coordinating between the military team and local volunteers, returned to Ethan's position as dusk approached. His expression was carefully neutral, but the slump of his shoulders told its own story. "Ethan," he began gently, "the temperature's dropping. We need to get you inside somewhere. The command center Harris set up in the West Wing has heat." "I'm staying here," Ethan replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Exhaustion had begun to take its toll, the adrenaline of the previous day giving way to a bone-deep weariness that even his determination couldn't overcome. Rebecca, who had been speaking with one of Westfield's team nearby, approached with resolve in her step. "Ethan, listen to me. You cannot help Shadow if you get hypothermia. We're moving you inside for a few hours. The search will continue." Perhaps it was the firmness in her voice, or simply his body's inability to resist any longer, but Ethan finally nodded. As Mason began to maneuver his wheelchair toward the intact section of the building, Ethan cast one last look at the darkening woods. "We'll find him, Mom," he whispered, his voice catching. "We have to." Rebecca said nothing, simply squeezing his shoulder as she walked alongside. The unspoken fear hung between them that perhaps this time hope alone might not be enough. Dawn broke on the 3rd day after the fire, painting the Montana sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. Ethan sat in the makeshift command center that had been established in Oak Ridge's western wing, his wheelchair positioned by a window that overlooked the property. Despite his mother's pleas, he had refused to return home. instead sleeping fitfully on a cot brought in by one of Colonel Westfield's team members. The search for Shadow had continued without pause, rotating teams working through the nights with thermal equipment and trained tracking dogs. Local volunteers had expanded the search radius to 5 miles in every direction, posting flyers in nearby towns and checking shelters throughout the county. The community's response had been overwhelming. People who had seen Ethan and Shadow at the challenge, who had read about their remarkable partnership, appeared daily to offer help, food, and support. Colonel Westfield had remained on site, his initial team supplemented by additional personnel who arrived discreetly in unmarked vehicles. Their presence fueled speculation among the Oak Ridge staff about Shadow's importance to military interests, but Westfield revealed little, maintaining that their primary goal was humanitarian, finding a service dog essential to a disabled teenager's independence. Rebecca entered the command center carrying 2 cups of coffee, the dark circles under her eyes testament to her own sleepless vigil. She handed 1 cup to Ethan, then sat in a folding chair beside his wheelchair. "Mason called from the North Ridge," she reported. "Nothing yet, but they've found evidence that an animal passed through that area recently disturbed ground. Possible paw prints." Ethan nodded, accepting the information without visible reaction. The initial shock and denial had given way to a strange, hollow calmness. He spoke little now, conserving his energy and emotions as though they were finite resources that might be depleted before Shadow was found. Mason returned mid-morning, his clothes mud-stained and his face haggard from the overnight search. He nodded briefly to Rebecca before crouching beside Ethan's wheelchair, his voice low and measured. "Ethan, Colonel Westfield wants to try something different. His team has brought specialized equipment from Washington, sensory devices that might detect Shadow if he's still in the area, but they need something with his scent, something he was closely bonded with." Ethan understood immediately. They need me out there." Mason nodded. "The terrain is rough, but they've mapped a route your wheelchair can manage with assistance. I'll be with you the whole time." For the first time in days, a spark of hope flickered in Ethan's eyes. "When do we go?" "They're setting up now. We'll leave in 30 minutes. Rebecca protested initially, concerned about Ethan's already exhausted state and the physical challenges of navigating woodland paths in a wheelchair. But seeing the renewed determination in her son's face, she relented, insisting only that she accompany them with emergency medical supplies. The search team assembled at the edge of the property where the woods began to thicken. Colonel Westfield, 2 of his specialists carrying equipment in rugged backpacks, Mason, Rebecca, and Ethan in his all-terrain wheelchair that had been equipped with oversized wheels for the expedition. Frank Dawson joined them with his Malinois Ranger, the dog's tracking skills having proven valuable in narrowing search areas. "Here's how this works," Westfield explained, kneeling to address Ethan directly. "We've identified 3 areas where thermal anomalies have been detected over the past 36 hours, heat signatures that could be a large dog. They're all within a 2-mile radius, but in terrain too dense for vehicles. We'll check each location with you present, using Ranger's tracking abilities and our sensory equipment. If Shadow is in the vicinity, the combination of familiar scents yours and Mason's plus the specialized calls might draw him out." The first location was a disappointment, a rocky outcropping where a family of raccoons had established a den, their body heat creating the thermal signature detected by the equipment. The second yielded nothing but an abandoned hunter's blind, empty and undisturbed for what appeared to be months. As they approached the third location, a steep ravine approximately 2 miles northeast of Oak Ridge, the mood among the search party had grown somber. Even Ethan's determined optimism showed signs of fracturing. His shoulders slumped with the weight of impending loss. Rebecca walked close beside his wheelchair, occasionally resting her hand on his shoulder, offering silent support. The path narrowed as they descended toward the ravine, requiring Mason and one of Westfield's men to physically support the wheelchair on the steepest sections. A small stream cut through the bottom of the ravine, its banks muddy and uneven. Ranger, who had been ranging ahead of the group, suddenly tensed, his posture alerting Frank to a change in the scent trail. "He's got something," Frank reported, allowing the dog more lead to investigate. "Recent animal activity, definitely canine." Colonel Westfield signaled his team to deploy their equipment, a sophisticated electronic device that emitted sounds at frequencies beyond human hearing, designed to attract trained military working dogs from a distance. Ethan watched with held breath as they calibrated the machine, his heart pounding painfully against his ribs. "Ethan," Mason said softly, "if Shadow is nearby, he might be injured or in survival mode. He may not respond as you're used to." "Let me approach first if we locate him." Ethan shook his head. "If he's hurt or scared, I need to be the one. He trusts me." Mason looked as though he might argue, but something in Ethan's expression stopped him. Instead, he helped position the wheelchair in a small clearing where Ethan would be visible from multiple approaches. "Call for him," Westfield directed. "Your voice carries associations the equipment can't replicate." Ethan cupped his hands around his mouth. "Shadow, come." His voice broke on the command, emotion finally piercing the calm facade he had maintained for days. "Shadow, where are you come?" The ravine amplified his call, echoing it through the trees. Silence followed, broken only by the soft burble of the stream and the occasional rustle of wind through pine needles. Minutes stretched, agonizingly slow, as they waited for any response. Ranger suddenly stiffened, his attention fixed on a dense thicket across the stream. Frank tightened his grip on the leash, interpreting the dog's behavior. "He's caught a strong scent. Something's over there." Westfield's team immediately redirected their equipment toward the thicket, adjusting settings as Ranger's behavior confirmed their target. Mason moved closer to Ethan's wheelchair, his posture protective but hopeful. Rebecca pressed her hand to her mouth, afraid to speak, to breathe, to shatter the fragile moment with any sound that might interfere. The thicket rustled, branches parting as something pushed through from the other side. For a heartbeat, no one moved, the entire search party frozen in anticipation. Then, emerging from the shadows, limping but upright, his black and tan coat matted with mud and debris, was Shadow. The German shepherd paused at the edge of the clearing, his amber eyes immediately finding Ethan in his wheelchair. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, dog and boy stared at each other across the intervening space, recognition and relief passing between them without need for words. "Shadow," Ethan whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The sound broke the spell. Shadow moved forward, his limp more pronounced as he crossed the shallow stream, but his focus unwavering from Ethan. The search team stepped back, creating a clear path between the dog and his handler. As Shadow reached Ethan's wheelchair, he didn't jump or bark or display any of the frantic joy one might expect after such a separation. Instead, with the quiet dignity that had always characterized their relationship, he simply placed his head on Ethan's lap, allowing the boy's trembling hands to stroke his filthy fur. "You came back," Ethan murmured, tears streaming freely down his face. "I knew you would." Shadow's only response was to press closer, a soft whine escaping his throat as Ethan's fingers found a matted patch of blood on his flank. Despite the injury, despite whatever ordeal he had endured in the days since the fire, Shadow had survived. More than that, he had found his way back to Ethan, drawn by the bond that connected them across disaster and distance. As Rebecca knelt beside them, already assessing Shadow's injuries with professional efficiency, Ethan bent forward until his forehead rested against the dog's. In that moment of reconnection, the world around them, the search team, the ravine, the lingering questions about the fire and Shadow's disappearance receded into insignificance. What mattered was only this: they had found each other again. Two survivors refusing to be defined by the losses life had dealt them. "Let's get you both home," Rebecca said softly, her own tears barely contained. "It's time to heal." In life's autumn years, when our bodies begin to betray us, and society too often looks past rather than at us, we recognize in Ethan and Shadow's story a truth we've learned through decades of living. It's not our limitations that define us, but how we respond to them. Many of us have felt the sting of being underestimated, set aside, or labeled as past our prime. We've known the grief of losing someone we love, the fear of becoming dependent on others, and the quiet courage it takes to begin again when the world has changed beneath our feet. This is why Ethan's unwavering faith in Shadow speaks directly to our hearts. It reminds us of the stubborn hope we've clung to in our darkest hours through cancer diagnoses, after burying spouses, when our children moved thousands of miles away. Like Ethan refusing to believe Shadow was gone, we've sat vigil through long nights, holding space for possibilities others couldn't see. And how many times has our faith been rewarded, not always in the ways we expected, but in moments of grace that proved we were right to keep believing Ethan and Shadow found each other across impossible odds, because they refused to surrender to other people's definitions of what was possible. A lesson those of us with silver in our hair have learned through a lifetime of perseverance. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.